Dr. Samir Saran, President, Observer Research Foundation, Mr. Yatin Kakodkar, President, International Center Goa, ICG, Mr. Datta Raj Salgaonkar, Vice President, ICG, ICG members and distinguished guests, few faculty members and students, and media persons. Good evening and welcome to the International Center Goa. We are delighted and honored to be hosting Dr. Samir Saran for a talk on the third way, India and the Global South. First, please join me in welcoming Dr. Saran. As I mentioned, Dr. Saran is president of the Observer Research Foundation, and for a while, actually, I think about 10 years, more. His research focuses on issues of global governance, climate and energy policy, technology policy, and India's foreign policy. He curates the Raisina Dialogue, India's annual flagship platform on geopolitics and geoeconomics, and is the founder of SIFI, India's annual conference on cybersecurity and internet governance. Dr. Saran is the author of 4 books, including the 2020 book, The New World Disorder, and The Indian Imperative with Shashi Tharoor, and of several academic papers and book chapters. He is featured regularly in Indian and international print and broadcast media. The way we have set up today's talk is Dr. Saran will speak for approximately 40 minutes. This will be followed by a Q&A session of about 30 minutes. Please keep your questions short and let them be questions, not observations. And please state who you are for the benefit of everyone. So the Q&A session will be approximately 30 minutes. And we'll try to wrap it up by around 8:10, 8:15. Dr. Saran has to leave for an online meeting that he's committed to, so he'll be leaving around 8:15, 8:30. Before we begin, may I kindly request you to switch off your mobile phones or silence them. Thank you. Dr. Saran?
Thank you. Let me first thank Mr. Salgaonkar. I think I'm here because he's a man you can't say no to, and of course you can't say no to Goa, and you can't say no to Mr. Salgaonkar. And when he nudged me to think about coming to Goa, before he could complete his invitation, I said yes. So in some ways, that's how you guys have to spend your Monday evening with me. You can blame it on Mr. Salgaonkar. Let me also acknowledge the president of the center. Thank you for having me here, sir. And of course, Pushkar, the very gracious host, who I'm delighted to spend this evening with discussing the third way. So let me first try and explain the title to you, the third way. And this has no linkages to the third world. That's not what I was trying to convey here. What I was really trying to do was to try and come up with a framework that will position India uniquely amongst the Committee of Nations in the 21st century. The first way is a very familiar way from the last century. Muscular superpowers exerting political and economic control over the spheres of influence. You had the Soviet bloc, you had the bloc of the United States of America, and you had others trying to find some room somewhere to have some sense of self and identity and their own spaces, and maybe that is where the global south and the third world emerged from. The third world that did not fall into the first and second blocks of countries that defined the 20th century. So I think that is the first way of global influence, global eminence, global power, and I call that the first way that we have seen in the last 80 years. The second way is more contemporary, most visibly defined by China, but many others have copied it as well in their smaller regions, which is what I would call economic muscularity, that you dominate through the dependencies you build around your economic outcomes. China became the manufacturing hub for the world. It became the factory of the world. It became part of every supply chain that defines our lives even today. Don't believe the decoupling theory. There is only China in our hands, China in our homes, China in our car, China where you sit. And that is the second way in which you became an indispensable economic actor. Mind you, China never, and perhaps will never, have the same political muscularity and influence that Americans did at their peak, or the Soviets did in their peak. They will never be able to exert that kind of veto and control over global affairs. They will never be able to topple governments and install puppet regimes, although they have been able to do so through the longer play of economic statecraft and debt trap diplomacy, and making governments collapse due to the burdens of bad economics. They've been able to enforce some of those outcomes as well, but they will never have that kind of presence and eminence and power that the Americans and Soviets did at their peak. And I think the Chinese represent what I call the second way, which is less politically muscular, more reliant on economic prowess and economic competence, more relying on partnerships and investments and deals and trading relationships, and becoming an indispensable part of the stories of many countries that are emerging at this particular moment. So let me just try and tell you, so that all of us understand where India is today. We are roughly $4 trillion. We are roughly $2,600 to $2,700 per capita income. We are exactly where China was in 2009. Exactly. When the financial crisis hit, this is the situation of China. So we are what China was in 2009, and just look at economic statecraft at work in less than a decade after the financial crisis. So by 2018, 2019, China was the #1 trading partner to more than 100 countries worldwide. China was bailing out the Greeks in 2013-14. It was supporting Portuguese, it was supporting Spain, it was investing in many other countries. So as a $4 trillion economy, it moved to 10 and then $15 trillion in a decade, in a period of a decade. That is perhaps our story as well. Maybe not $15 trillion, but certainly if we do simple things at scale and simple things right, I visualize an India which is $10 trillion in 2034. And in some sense, what is this journey going to be? What is the India story, India's role in the world, India's engagement with the world going to be based on? So I think that is what I'm trying to define as the third way. I have in my article some time back mentioned that India will be like if America was the muscular superpower and China was the economic and manufacturing superpower, India will be the world's first development superpower. And the reason I say this is because in many ways, even as we take pride in our progress, we have to be a little stark in our assessment. We have to be real in our assessment. We are still talking about $2,600 per capita income, which is less than a sixth of the poorest country in EU. We have to be a little real about where we are. We are still really responding to challenges. You know, if you look at our elections and political debates, our main economic data and literature, you will find that we are still engaged with some very basic questions. Hunger, malnutrition, empowerment of women and finding them with space in the economic mainstream. We celebrate connecting 2 cities and 2 villages by trains. We still celebrate it. It is a celebratory occasion. We are excited when we open new airports and new ports and new logistics. We are still completing a 20th century agenda. So in some sense, we are still a nation primarily focused on alleviating misery and alleviating hardship, even as some parts of our country are beginning to excel and compete in the 21st century agenda as well. So in many ways, India of today has a 20th century agenda that is incomplete and a 21st century ambition that has already embraced India as one key stakeholder. There are at least 2 distinct centuries at work here, and if you go into the socio-cultural discussions, and I'm not going there, we probably also have an 18th and 19th century concurrently running here. So we are today in an India where centuries are colliding, and what comes out is largely a nation and a political class, and thank God for that, which is obsessed with alleviating hardship, misery, and it must even perhaps be more obsessed and perhaps become more efficient in responding to it. And they are increasingly being judged for that performance. And you can keep, literally trying to predict elections and then deconstruct them and decipher them and their outcomes. But let me tell you, if they deliver on key development indicators, they survive. That is where we have reached. Governments that don't perform on those key development indicators struggle. Now, of course, many other factors are icing on the cake and are catalysts and can mobilize and create collectives that become effective. But essentially, I think we are reaching a stage where development matters, and India today is a SDG nation. And we are going to be the world's first development power, a development-based large economy, a first development-based $10 trillion economy, which would still not have completed its primary development goals, even as it becomes the third and the only country, the third and the only third country in the world to reach the $10 trillion mark. So imagine such a large economy, and yet largely low income, and still struggling with some very basic and simple questions. So the India way for me, the third way that I'm trying to describe here, is India's engagement on development politics and development economics with 7 billion other humans on this planet who are in the same situation. The Americans served the first 500 million well, the Chinese served the next 1 billion well. India has an opportunity to find responses and answers for the next 7 billion. And I think that is the third way, and that is why India in the global south becomes a good question to chase, both from a strategic perspective and from an ethical, moral, and more humane perspective. So the title of my talk, The Third Way, is essentially about how can India's journey, successes and failures, be shared with a much larger cohort of humanity that is also essentially on similar journeys in different geographies. How can India's increasing capabilities in terms of policy and governance, but also in terms of finance and financial institutions, be put to use for the benefit of many who are below us in the development ladder? How can India's private sector be encouraged, and this is the most challenging task. I think our private sector is the least adventurous and least expeditionary in the world. They would rather have a 1 to 2% return in London than a 5 to 7% return in a city in Asia and 10% return in Africa. They would rather go for the 2% growth rate geographies because they are predictable and you get your curry houses right next door. So, but how do we get our private sector to participate in building up the next 7.5 billion people in sectors that we are adept at, from technology to pharma to small and medium enterprises based businesses and services, and of course the new age opportunities around AI and quantum and many other domains that are opening up. So my proposition today is that without necessarily theorizing about all of this, our political leadership has, through instinct and intuition, arrived at a conclusion that the 7 billion global south constituency, 85% of global population, is essentially India's key stakeholder base for the journey in the days ahead. So it was no accident that before India assumed its presidency of the G20 and asked the leaders of these big countries to meet for the first time, the Prime Minister reached out to 125 countries of the global south and heard them out, heard their aspirations, ambitions, challenges, opportunities that they seek around this particular forum, and then began the presidency thereafter. It was also not just a formality or a protocol that the Prime Minister reported back to these same countries post the presidency and appraised them of what was discussed prior to the G20 and what they were able to do during India's term in that particular year. And of course, most recently, a few months ago, India hosted the third Voice of the Global South Summit, where again 120 odd countries participated at head of government, head of state, as well as cabinet minister levels. So we are at that stage where we are trying to revive a stakeholder base that always belonged to us. And in some sense, this is back to the future, because the story does not start in 2023. The story starts in 1947, and it starts in the 40s and 50s when countries were emerging out of colonialism and were charting their own journeys and independent futures. In fact, if you would all recall, in 1951, 29, if I remember correctly, countries met in Bandung, and Suharto and Nehru and others put together a vision for a future that would not be either pulled into one corner of the world or the other, and put together a basis for a third space that would be available to those who were yet to exercise their full independence and freedom, and to force them to choose sides and become part and subjects of someone else's power dynamics at that particular time was undigestible. It was difficult for many to fathom. So in that sense, 1951 1955 and thereafter 1961, the non-aligned movement conference in Belgrade in Yugoslavia, you saw the emergence of this group of countries that were not willing to go back to a control regime exerted either by the United States of America or by the Soviet Union. So in many ways, what was the erstwhile third world, because it was a pejorative, they like to call us the third world, it was a insult. Corruption and weak governance and poverty and illiteracy and everything terrible in the world used to be in the third world. It was the pejorative. There was nothing celebratory about being called the third world, but we were still referred to as the third world. And they were largely the countries of the South that we engage with today. What emerged in that period from the 50s to the 80s was precisely the same block of countries that today we now meet under a new rubric called the Voice of the Global South Summit. Now, of course, at that particular point of time, the description was easy to formulate. The third world description was easy to formulate. You don't belong to either the American or the Russian side, and therefore you're the third world. The Europeans did try in the late 70s and early 80s, and I think it was Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of Germany, who was given the task by the World Bank, Robert McNamara, to actually try and map the north-south divide, the rich-poor divide, and how would the world look if economic arguments were used to frame the world. So there's a very interesting line that Willy Brandt, it is called the Brandt Report, and I think you can find it online. You can also find more information about this report if you just Google Willy Brandt and the Independent Commission on Development. It was a commission that they had set up. He came up with a very interesting line through the world map. That line of the map just went over Mexico, so Mexico was south. It went under literally all of Europe, so Europe was north. It very slyly curved above China, so China was south, and then it came down to Asia, and it did something dramatic where it curved around to exclude Australia and New Zealand, so they were north. So if you look at the line, it was a line that was in still contiguous, still one line, but in many ways it was in my view the first real attempt to map the north-south line and the north-south divide. It was not the equator, it was basically the economic equator, above which you had the rich and developed countries, and under which you had the poor and developing countries. And in some sense, towards the end of the century, maybe due to a result of awakening, I would argue it was due to the demise of the Soviet Union. When there was no second world, the third world itself was defunct, and the terminology global south emerged, and it became more popular to use than third world, which had been extensively deployed prior to that. So I think it was the end of the Soviet Union, which was the second world, that led to literally the discontinuation of the use of the third world, and largely now it is just a slang pejorative for bad airport facilities. You know, when you land in Berlin and you are frustrated, you call Berlin third world. That's what you do, right? So now it has literally become a pejorative and a slang to describe something that is terrible. But it used to be the identity ascribed to us by the first and second worlds, and in many ways that was the aperture and that was the assessment many of them still have of us. So just because the word has discontinued does not mean that the assessment is less relevant even today. And therefore, many of us literally used to have to respond to people when they ask questions, that why does India want to be referred to as the South? What is so appealing about being called the South? Why would anyone call themselves losers? For example, you know, why would you say that we are a bunch of global losers? And that was not because global South meant losers. That was because the identity and the attributes ascribed to the global South by the North made it resemble losers. So one of the biggest challenges in India's G20 presidency, and as it sought to invoke the voice of the Global South Summit as a parallel conversation to define its presidency at the G20, was to reclaim the identity of the South. And I think that was the biggest challenge, that how do you turn a group and a term that had everything wrong ascribed to it and make it something more appealing. And the fact was that this group of countries had something fundamentally going for them. Now let me try and tell you what those few things are, and why perhaps all of you should be proud that you belong to the Global South, and some of you we have embraced as being part of the Global South. But let me try to tell you that. One is the most recent, and maybe now a series of reports of the IMF. The last one was a few months ago, that shows quantifiably that close to 60% of all growth is coming from the Global South. 15 or 16% of global growth comes from India alone. Another 25 to 30% comes from China. But the fact is that the growth engine of the world are developing and emerging economies, and they have projected for the next 10 years this number 60% is only going to increase. So when we grow, Europeans do better. When we grow, American economy seems in pinker health. Our growth is now no longer just changing our lives. Our growth is changing your lives as well. And in some sense, today, and this is after a very long time, we are the growth economies. Like in the 50s and 60s, the Atlantic countries were the growth economies. The Western European and American system were the engines and the dynamos of global transformation. We are at that moment that now those countries below that line I described are the engines of this generation, and perhaps the next as well. So that's the first attribute of South. South today is equal to growth. We are the growth economies. That's the first attribute. The second attribute, we are the young economies. We have people. Something which is now beginning, the absence of which is now being felt in many parts of the world. India contributes 29% of the global workforce, the age in which people work. With 6% of global GDP or some number as around that, we contribute 29%, or we have the capacity to contribute 29% of the global workforce. In a couple of decades, 50% of young people in the world will be in the African continent. So youth, and youth has its own quality, is a global South phenomena. So we are the growth economies, we are the young economies. That is the second attribute. I'm not that young, but global South is. But that's the second attribute that we must consider as being a very positive attribute. the third, and this is important and people don't understand it, and we let the global north and the global west get away with this. We are the green economies. Our growth is delinked from carbon intensive practices of Europe and North America and even of China. There would be no other economy with such low per capita incomes that would have reached $10 trillion as India would. We would be the greenest $10 trillion economy. Our energy intensity of growth and our carbon intensity of growth are lower than any other similar sized economy. Let me give you a number. Around 200 gigawatts of renewables that we have installed in India under the Paris Agreement that we signed in 2015. That 200 gigawatts for a country which has a GDP lower than Germany today has been built by the country. The 200 gigawatts has been built by a country with a GDP same as Germany. That 200 gigawatts is equal to or nearly equal to the entire German electricity system. We have in the last 10 years installed more renewable energy than all of the EU 27 put together. As a poorer country with lower per capita income, we are putting more and investing more in gigawatts than anyone else. And same is the story in many other developing economies around the world. So we are the green transition that the world talks about. They are counting on us. If we were to behave like this, like how they behaved, 2/3 of all future emissions will come from the global south. We will all burn. When they say save the planet, they are literally begging for the global south not to do what they did. And they're not giving money. That's why I call them begging. Had they given us money, it would be partnership. They refuse to part with their money. They save their banks, they fight their wars, they don't want to save the planet with their money. You tell them we have to send soldiers to fight Russians in Ukraine, they will give you $200 billion and $300 billion, that's what they've done in the last 2-3 years. You tell them in Copenhagen in 2009, give us $100 billion, they tell you wait till 2020, and it still hasn't come. So they're not going to give you money. So the third attribute of the global south is that we are the green geographies who really care about the planet, who are actually walking the talk, whose investments for the future are based on green consciousness. Some imposed, some forced, but our younger generation today is far more aware than the younger generations who were building their countries at that time in Europe in the 20th century. You find one Greta Thunberg, we had so many here who are living that life. So we are the green geographies. They actually shame us when we talk about coal and fossil fuels, the younger generation in India. They are far more sensitive and aware of their responsibilities to the planet. So that's the third attribute. So we grow, we are young, we are green. So I'm just counting three bonuses. And the fourth, we love technology. Our economy is on our mobile phones, our politics is on our mobile phones, our government is on our mobile phones, our bank is on our mobile phones. We are a tech first ecosystem. From the M-Pesa in Kenya to the UPI in India and to everything in between, we are moving from the Jugaad countries, the Jugaad, the frugal innovation space, to cutting edge innovation. Today you have flow back from the south to the north in terms of innovation. Many international advanced economies are working with us to adopt health stack, identity stack, payment stacks in their own economies. So we are green, tech, young and growth geographies in some sense. In many ways, we had a blind spot. And I think that blind spot was responded to with a certain degree of humility. That blind spot was that irrespective of everything else I've spoken about as being the positives, what we were missing was the second engine of our political and economic ecosystems, which was the participation of women. And many of our geographies below that line that I described still happen to preserve practices and norms from a previous century. And that's what I was talking about, that we also have a few centuries in many of these countries. But I would argue that in 2023, by passing the Women Reservation Bill, and a few years before that by reserving political spaces for women in the third and second tier of governance, and thereafter making women-led growth, that was the term they used during India's G20 presidency, a feature of India's presidency. I think that hesitation that we had of being underperformers or not doing enough in this particular sector was converted into a strength by making it a call, a clarion call to do more here. Now, I'm not saying we have necessarily delivered here, don't get me wrong, but at least we have first acknowledged that this is a area of immense efforts and also opportunities that as a country we need to focus on. So in many ways, what the Indian G20 presidency and what I call the third way has tried to do was to change the attributes of the global south as being poor and illiterate and laggards and literally dependent people. Which were largely relying on the Lajis from the north. We, during our presidency in 2023, tried to reclaim the definition of the global south and make it into a more nifty group, more appealing group, and pardon my French, a more sexy group, where we were young, where we were growing, where we were tech first, where we were green first, and where we were counting on women to lead us to a new format of growth and political engagement for the future. And that was the reclaiming of identity that India decided to actually promote during its 2023 global presidency, G20 presidency. And each of these elements that I've spoken about have one essential character. That was to change the lives of their own people, to alleviate misery, and to make governance and services more accessible to many who had never benefited from these, from banking to insurance to health services, etc., etc., etc. And in my view, I wrote a piece that was carried by a few different publications, where I argued that this is, for me, the beginnings of a New Delhi consensus on what a future world should focus on and what Delhi should strive to invest into, and should use its growing capacities as a fast rising economic actor to invest into. And this is the second point I wanted to make. We have shown, and I know there is some rhetoric, but it's true, we have shown, and not today, we have shown pretty much since our independence, that even when we were struggling to make our own ends meet, we were generous in sharing when people needed our assistance and help. We have shown that in our 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and today we do it with far more alacrity, and we are able to do it bigger scale, and of course we benefit from a much wider appreciation of it due to social media and many other formats where we are able to disseminate our actions. We have been a largely generous nation, even when we were very poor, and our core ethic that needs to be taken forward as we change as a nation is that generosity. And I think that is what our policy must focus on, that how do we take that generous India that lived when we were rather poor, how do we take that generous India forward as we move to $10,000 per capita income and then 15 and 20 and more? Can that generous India be nourished, and can that generous India act? Recent developments tell me that that generous India is alive and kicking. When Sri Lanka collapsed, and when neither the Paris Club, the rich donors from the north, or China was willing to bail them out, the Indian government did open its wallet strings, and close to $4 or $4.5 billion were dispatched in quite short notice to stymie the economic hardship, but also to immediately provide some succor to the people in Sri Lanka. And therefore, when you have an entirely different regime that ran a political campaign that was quite hostile to India previously, you do not see any change in relationships, and you see that continuing. You saw what India did with the Afghan people. The governments changed in Kabul, but our commitment to the people did not change. And you have seen how, despite us not having any relationships with Taliban, the Afghan people and the government in Kabul still remains favorably inclined to India. We have shown that generosity in our relationship in Afghanistan as well. And now most recently you saw what happened in Maldives, how we have turned around a relationship that was looking complicated, and I have no doubt you would see that same outcomes in Bangladesh as well. So I think that generous India through its recent actions, I believe, lives, but we must not take it for granted, and we must embed it as part of our growth culture, strategic culture, development culture for the future. And I want to just conclude this second part by highlighting that there is going to be no country, and I mean this with all seriousness, no country in the next decade who will put, and I'm using the word carefully, who will put more fresh development assistance onto the global table than India. Some of my colleagues have calculated, and I've done a short piece on this, that over the next decade we are going to pump in at least $100 billion of development, what was earlier called aid. India does not call it that, India calls it development partnership. So we are going to be putting in $100 billion of unattached, unconditional money in support of others. The big questions before us is who and where. So what are the geographies we need to work with? Who are our priorities? And I don't think we've had a serious conversation as a country that how do we prioritize the geographies and regions where we become more active. And if we do, what are the outcomes that we seek from these investments that we make? Do we want it to be DFID, the British Development Agency in the last century, or the GIZ, the German agency? Do we want a model like that, that we put money for certain sectors and certain outcomes, like climate or women-led growth? Or do we define that money, or do we continue with India's existing tradition of a bottoms-up approach, where it is the donee and not the donor that defines the terms of how that money is used and where it is deployed? So which is the donee-led engagement, which is very unique about the Indian model of development partnerships, where it is those who we support who decide what they do with the grants and the support that we give to them. And I think that's the big questions that we really need to answer, because we are going to be putting significant money. As a $4 trillion economy, we have shown that we have put significant money. When we were, like I said, a poorer country, we were still generous. At $10 and $15 trillion in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, we will need to really think about how we exercise this generous ethic that we must continue forward in our engagement with the world. And I think that's the second point on the third way. One was the attributes and defining what that third way is: young, growth, tech, green, women-led. That's one way, the definition of it. The second is our role as an actor and as an agent in catalyzing many of these changes that we seek to bring forth. And the third, of course, is what do we do with the private sector? And this is an important point, and I started with the private sector. Let me conclude the third way with our private sector. And I think I have 5-6 minutes more. I'll try to conclude in that. If you look at the tax to GDP ratios, and all of you can Google it, tax to GDP ratios G20 countries, you will be shocked. You will be shocked how small the Indian government is. So just take a tax to GDP ratio of France and take a tax to GDP ratio of India, we are about a third. Indian government has 1/3 the capabilities of a similar size government in one of these other G20 countries. That's the point I'm trying to make. That while we may be a $4 trillion economy, the capacity, the tax revenues, the money that is available with the Indian government is perhaps only half of what it should be if we were to take an average of a much wider group of countries and not only the G20. So I call it, we are literally running on a government that is throttled due to our rather low level of revenue collection and participation in the tax ecosystem, and therefore we are, even at $4 trillion, a government with $2 trillion capabilities. But that is not the story of the Indian GDP. India's GDP lives outside the government, and increasingly 30 to 40% of it resides with India's private sector, which is now competent, global, ambitious. And yet that part of India's story is not necessarily kicking into the third way that I really want to focus on. And by the way, India's philanthropic culture is weaker, we all know that, and we don't have necessarily the same appetite that many other countries around the world have exhibited, certainly in the global north. We don't see that here. But I think it would be simplistic to dismiss the important role India's private sector has played in social and cultural upliftment through the centuries. So while we may not have a Western style culture of philanthropy, I think Indian private sector, from the Tatas and thereafter, certainly in modern India, have been engaged in socio-cultural projects, even though some could argue that they largely concentrated those socio-cultural projects in the footprints of their own businesses and did not necessarily extend it beyond. I think there is a promise that they can be nudged to do more, but yet I would say that is perhaps the single biggest sector and opportunity that India must focus on if A, it has to solve its own development challenges that I talk about, but B, take the India story, the Indian solutions, the Indian responses to some of these most wicked problems of our times, from solar lamps and LED bulbs and ethanol based transportation, or battery based solutions, or even in the future more sophisticated technology based health diagnosis and architectural and resilient adaptive infrastructure, etc. It is this private sector that is bigger than government today, that has more resources than the government of India today already. It is possibly going to be twice the size of the Indian government in the coming decade, and it will have the experience of responding and building business models around alleviating misery and hardships. India's response to misery and hardships is an economic model. We cannot give doles to wipe away the intensity of the challenge that we face. We have to create business models to respond to it. Businesses at the bottom of the pyramid is India's response to SDGs, and you can see from the payment ecosystems to the health ecosystems, we have micro insurances today. And let me just give you a couple of examples to close. We have micro insurances today, which are literally 10 rupees for the number of hours you're going to be riding a truck to give you that insurance for that duration. Literally, you are buying insurance for the time you are exposed to certain dangers. We have built these like you have shampoo sachets, because we couldn't buy the whole shampoo bottle when we were a developing country. We used to buy sachets so that we could use it once a month or twice a week or whatever, depending on your level of influence, you would buy the number of sachets. We have sachet-sized insurance schemes. We also have sachet-sized investment schemes. Till 2016, before Digital India and before Jio and others came and broadbanded India into free data and the next century, we used to have the growth of total assets under management, which is financial assets, literally 7 to 8%. They used to track the Indian economic growth story, which means that as Mr. Salgaonkar or Pushkar grew their incomes, they would invest in the financial sector by that same amount. It was basically the same amount of folks whose income grew and they were investing back into the sector. You had assets under management track the economic growth story. In 2016, there was a break. We now have 15 to 16% growth happening. We have more people entering the financial segment at 100 rupees mutual funds. Today you have dollar mutual funds a month. So people are creating saving instruments to tap into this whole demographic that until now was non-banked, invisible, and certainly could not have any credit worthiness because there was no footprints that they left in the credit markets. But today, due to digital banks and digital payments and digital transactions, you can assess their capacity to be part of the financial sector, to get loans, to invest in instruments, and you have a private sector response to that development challenge that I was talking about, of financial inclusion, of onboarding people onto the mainstream. So here you are seeing that private sector of India, from the tech sector to the financial sector to the health sector to the rural economy sector, it is empowered to go and take their experience and knowledge to the next 7 billion who live like us in different parts of the world. And this is not philanthropy, this is a business opportunity. If we can do it here, if we can get it right for the diversity of this country, if we can serve the stratified demographics that exist here, we are better prepared to serve the next 7 than anyone in the Atlantic countries ever was. And I think this is an India opportunity, and this is the third way, that we will build businesses even as we lift people out of hardship and we alleviate people of sufferings. This is an economic model, this is an ethical model, and this is the third way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Saran, for a sophisticated and detailed discussion and analysis of, I thought, India in the 21st century. I mean, we can talk about the global south as well, but pretty much about India. I'll have the privilege of asking the first 3 questions. They'll all be very short. Do you see the 21st century as an opportunity for India and the global south broadly to re-theorize international relations? Not just in terms of the practice of international affairs, but also academically re-theorize. And this is where there might be some weakness among Indian higher education institutions, broadly even think tanks and such. One. Second, one of the things that often comes to mind, and that's also because I have some background in South America, is India becoming a Brazil of the 21st century. Growing inequality. In Brazil, they have that expression, Bel India. So is India becoming the 21st century Brazil? And attached to it is, of course, the idea that we may be caught in a middle income trap despite our demographic advantages, because the demographic dividend will not be fully realized because of, let's say, low participation of women in the workforce, the quality of education, etc., etc. The third is, of course, I sort of mentioned already, where do you see India's knowledge sector over the next 10, 20 years? Because you have the national education policy, and really much depends on what we do with knowledge production.
You're quite brutal, Pushkar, but let me try and respond to you. Re-theorize IR. I don't think we have to re-theorize IR or even political science. I think we have to literally bring out our own experiences through the millennia and make it more accessible to those who want to study these fields. I mean, we have an English school, we have a Chinese, literally a Chinese section in every library from Sun Tzu and others who speak about international engagement. We should make the effort to make India's own experiences and India's own scholarship available to those who want to pursue that particular field. I don't think A set of knowledge or B set of knowledge is the right way to go forward, but I think having a kaleidoscope of information of the past, experiences of different folks in different geographies, and certainly of those who have served your own immediate localities is essential. And I think we are beginning to see that. I would argue that in the last 20 years, if nothing else, we have seen a large number of Indian scholarship emerge. And Indian scholarship out of Indian universities in India, and not Indian scholarship emerging out of Oxbridge and the east coast of America or the west coast of America. I think you are now seeing Indian scholars produce their views You may or may not agree with them, you may contest them, but that's the whole point of scholarship. That's the whole point of putting the propositions on the table. I think we are beginning to do that. Are we doing that enough? Perhaps not. And I'll come to that in a bit. And the response to that is the same challenge I told you. Our government may seem to be a government managing a $4 trillion economy, but the tax to GDP ratio at 15, 16, 17% is half of what it should be, and is half of what other countries have. And therefore, our government will always struggle to be able to pay the $100 billion required for your defense budget, the large social protection bills that you have to serve, from food to health to other benefits. You will always have to, in many ways, manage the limited resources you have, simply because enough people are not contributing to the tax sector yet. And hopefully in the next 10 years, we will, like we have seen in the last 3 or 4 years, we will see an increase of our tax collections, and you will see greater government surpluses that would be able to be deployed there. So I see a greater explosion and the need for a greater intensity of authentic Indian scholarship emerge, but more importantly, it needs to emerge in the vernacular space as well. And I think our obsession with the English language and English scholarship should now be dispensed with, and we should allow people in their own languages to come up with their own learnings and theories and responses and solutions that then must be taken by national libraries and made more polysemic and made it into languages that are accessible to a wider audience. But promote, all over the world there is a move of traditional knowledge and sustainable practices from the past and community-based development. It's all about looking back to find responses for the future. I think we are a land that has a past so rich, that has a history that is so complex and layered, that from the good and the bad and the ugly, we could literally share successes, failures and experiences around every issue. And we must tap into that tapestry of experiences that we have. So yes, I'm a believer that we don't need to re-theorize international relations or political science. We need to make it richer by adding our flavor to it, and I think that is missing, and that flavor is essential, and India must join, must now sit on that table and contribute to the palette of information, of learnings, of knowledge that others partake in. We must be a contributor to global knowledge production, and that in some ways also touches on the last part, but I have something special for that. Inequality. Look, we may not be, we will become a Brazilian type economy if two dramatic things were to happen at the same time. A, we were to see stagnation of growth and growth of inequality. So if both of them happen, then you become Brazil. In India, while inequality may exist, the fact is mobility and growth is spread across the economic classes. As long as you can ensure that people's lives are changing and the lived experience of people today is better than it was yesterday, and there is a genuine belief, like there is in most Indians today, that tomorrow will be better, you will not become the Brazil of the 20th century. Brazil did not have this attribute.
Lack of growth.
Correct. They lacked growth completely, and they were unequal, and most Brazilians till today don't believe that tomorrow is going to be better. That still has not changed about. They have a permanent melancholy that is very Portuguese and perhaps even Goan. I don't want to go there, but maybe port wine, I don't know, but there is a melancholic attribute to Brazil that is very palpable and remarkable. So no, I don't think we are going to be a Brazil as long as we don't hit this perfect storm where we have stagnation of growth and growth of inequality. I don't think we are anywhere near that, for the simple reason that a robust, diverse democracy like India makes our leaders deliver today, and they are booted out when they don't deliver. And I am now literally talking about the state elections, where the turnover is brutal, really brutal, and development questions that we are talking about are largely state subjects, and they are dispensed at the level of the state. By the way, I was just coming in from the airport, and I asked the person who was kind enough to take me to the hotel, and I was asking him about how is Goa doing now, and I was literally, I don't want those to become data points for any research, but I'm just telling you that people's lived experience matter. Eventually, if an individual believes his today is better than yesterday and tomorrow is going to be even better than today, there is something positive for the country to look forward to. And I think India is at that decade where genuinely there seems to be a much larger segment of population that is counting on a better tomorrow, right? So Brazil, perhaps not, and I hope not. But, and this is an important but, that India is going to get to the places I spoke about, 10 trillion, 15 trillion, is not a settled matter. There are many pieces that need to remain in place or fall into place for that to happen. $10 trillion is still only a $6,000 per capita income country. It is still largely a very low income country. There's nothing to literally celebrate even at a $10 trillion size. The vast number of low income people make us a very big economy. So we will have huge global implications, because remember, at $10 trillion, India would add $3 trillion of additional international trade every year to the global system. That's huge. So while our per capita income is only $6,000, we are adding $3 trillion of import and exports into the global system. We are going to change the oceans economy permanently. $2 trillion will be on oceans, or $1.5 trillion will be through the ocean economy. So we are going to change, the coastlines and infrastructure and ports and logistics and shipping and container. Our global implications and macro implications will be huge, but at the individual level, we are still talking about a $6,000 per capita income. We are still trying to literally find means and ways of good education institutions, better healthcare, connectivity, and many questions that still exist today. So that's many of these assumptions are still assumptions, and there is nothing settled in this India story other than the fact that I can sense that momentum, and now we have reached that stage where our sheer size and modest growth, even modest growth, means that we add a South Africa to our GDP every year. And this is significant. We add a South Africa to our GDP every year. No, I mean, you must try and understand where we are today. Modest growth of 6% plus 2 to 3% inflation means we add $400 billion to our GDP every year. Vietnam we added last year. No, I'm just telling you. So just try to understand what I'm trying to say. We are at that part where China was in 2009. And by the way, after 2009, China never had 10% double-digit growth rates. If you look at the numbers, they were all 6-7% and some inflation. That's where we are, 6-7% and some inflation. That's where we are. So it is not a settled story, lots to be done, but something to look forward to. Now, knowledge sector, very interesting. So there's a study I read. One of my scholars had produced a paper, and I was just reading, I was sitting and reading that particular publication. Actually, that publication carried a footnote, and I was reading the footnoted publication that had been done by someone outside of my organization. And it had a very interesting statistic. The statistic was that in 1996, thereabouts, I may be wrong, my years might be wrong by a year or two, so forgive me, but the essence is correct. In the 90s, in the middle 90s, average spend on education in India's houses, you remember we do those big household surveys? I'm talking about those big household surveys. In 1996, 95, 96, that household survey showed that roughly an Indian house spent 5 to 6% of its annual expenditure on education. So if you were spending $100 a year, you would spend $5 to $6 towards education. 1995-96 average, gross average across the country. And by the way, these surveys don't capture the top 5% and the bottom 5%. It's like the middle 90% that these surveys capture. In 2015-16, you had the same block of survey done, and that showed that that number had moved to 25%. There was a 5-time increase in household expenditure as a percentage of expenditure on education. The household incomes and expenditure had itself grown up, had increased by 20x or something from the 90s, where we were literally coming out of our economic crisis in the early 90s to 2015-16s, right? So there was this huge expenditure that leap, and then within that there was this huge increase in percentage of expenditure on education. So now not only were people spending on basic education, but also higher education and education overseas, etc., etc., etc. You saw in this journey a country that had a ready and organically curated ecosystem that was willing to invest in knowledge. Indian houses and Indian households, no matter rich or poor, privilege investment in knowledge over most other expenditure. So we have a country that is ready to invest in learning more and invest in the next generation to learn more. Our challenge is, do we have the products to give against that expenditure they are making? And are we literally making the most benefit, using this opportunity of a hunger, a knowledge hunger that exists in our households, and give them 21st century skills and information and talent and inputs that will make them part of the fourth industrial revolution, that will make them part of the digital age, of the green transitions, of various other issues that I spoke about, from infrastructure to connectivity to etc., etc. So for me, our advantage is that India believes in investing in knowledge. Are we building institutions that are actually making the most of this Indian attribute? Answer is no. We spend so much money and we deliver unemployable outputs. We also have privileged the long form education over skills and outcome based education. Many economies in the past, and most of them who have really done well, they have always had parallel education systems. One that have gone on to do their masters and PhDs and technical degrees, etc., and others that have gone on to produce skills that are relevant for manufacturing and services and daily businesses and economic activities. In India, skills is seen as an additionality and not as a career option by itself. You say that yes, I will do my undergrad and I will also do a skilling program alongside it. In India, we are still not betting on skills being essential and adequate for producing outcomes that are important for. So I think we have to rethink our knowledge system. It has to be a bit of policy impulse. It also has to be socio-cultural transformations, because eventually this is the family that invests in the knowledge sector, and they are the ones who, my father decided I'm going to be an engineer. And he had decided in the 90s you have to be an engineer, then do an MBA, then join the private sector, then get married. That was my life sequence. At 35 I changed all of them. I went back to college, did political science, went and did my PhD. So I the first 15 years I gave to my dad, the next I'm giving to myself. So the point I'm trying to make is there is also a socio-cultural aspect of what we do with this Indian inbuilt positive attribute towards investing in the knowledge systems. So I think our knowledge system requires a 21st century upgrade. And I find it true because I meet so many people from different sectors. I see it in my own sector. It is difficult to, you can find so many postgraduates. It is so difficult to find a postgraduate that is employable.
Thank you, Samir, Dr. Saran. Now we'll take about 3-4 questions.
I'm Yatin Kakodkar. Thank you for explaining the third way. Your point is well made that India, in its pursuit of the third way, its stakeholders are the 7 billion people / the global south. China is also in pursuit of this global south for influence. How different and how better is India's approach to China's approach? First question. And the second question is it a zero-sum game, or is it a win-win situation in this pursuit of influence?
Okay. No, sure, that's fine. No, I think this is a very valid question. For me, what is different between India and China is essentially the character of the two states. And let me try and answer this through a question that I asked Ashley Tellis once. Ashley Tellis is a very well-known scholar on IR. I asked him this question once as a much younger man, that Ashley, you keep complaining about Chinese hegemony, but America was a hegemon. No, I asked him this question, that what is the difference between America and China? You were both hegemons, you both were bullies, you both, why are you now crying that China is doing what you have always done, right? So what is so different about? He gave me an answer which, by the way, I think is also relevant to us. He told me, he says, look, you can complain about American hegemony and American high-handedness in certain situations, but please understand, America allowed its democracy to be penetrated by voices from all over. You could participate in their media, you could write in their magazines, you could comment in their newspapers, you could be on their television studios, you could hold a placard outside the White House, you could protest outside Capitol Hill, you could go to senators and congressmen and ask them to take up a cause that was around clean air and fossil fuels and labor and Vietnam and whatever else you wanted to. He says that it was a democratic open society that allowed itself to be affected, implicated and infect others with the debates everyone was having. It was an open society. And essentially, my argument is that we are open societies as well. Essentially, we can keep talking about इसने सरकार ने ये कर दिया और सरकार boss. Every morning, if you are on Twitter, X number of people get up and abuse the government, X number of people get up and praise the government. You have all sorts of people in India saying all sorts of things all the time, and every government has done stupidities in the last 70-75 years. And the reality here is that we must never let go of this essentially open character and argumentative culture and the discursive space that has been built and tempered over a millennia to dissipate. We must retain this, and that will allow folks to have greater trust in us. When they can see our debates and they can understand our predicaments, they are able to be more empathetic to some of the decisions we make. With China, it is opaque. If Xi Jinping decides that this is the interest rate, who will you go and protest to? Will you hold a placard against Xi Jinping in Beijing? That's the last time you will hold a placard. So my point I'm trying to say here is that essentially our third way has this very important ingredient, that we are dispelling the notions that in this century, a developing country which is a fairly robust democracy cannot provide leadership, economic leadership, development leadership to its companions and compatriots and co-travelers in the development journey. Till now, it was that you have to be a Chinese-like system to do well. Our growth, though delayed, is going to give a democratic alternative to the fact that you can become $10 trillion without necessarily having to become part of the Communist Party regime in any part of the world. So I think that is one big difference, that we must retain that open character, so that they may laugh at us today and they may find us inefficient, but when we are $10 trillion, they will realize that there was method to our madness, and it is something that they can emulate as well. We must never let the madness go that exists today. It is not a bad thing. It is a good thing. And it need not be zero-sum. And I think it need not be zero-sum. I think we also have an opportunity to actually build a future where both China and India coexist. Now, I have written some really harsh pieces on China, and my books is called Pax Sinica. My second last book that I wrote was Pax Sinica on Chinese aggressive and expansive behavior. I don't mince my words, but in my heart and in my writings in earlier times, I have actually argued that we both can and must work together. But I do not believe it is going to happen under Emperor Xi's regime. But the good news is Emperor Xi is also a human, and he will go, and we will still have elections. So my point here is that there is an opportunity for us to work together in the future. We were talking about doing many things together in 2009, 10, as even 13, even the Xi-Modi summit in South India, right? We were talking about working together. But Chinese determination to put together a multipolar world and a unipolar Asia does not work for us. They are willing to share power with 3 or 4 global leaders around the world, but they are not willing to coexist with people in Asia. They want Asia to be under their control and the world to be shared among some others. So I think that is problematic. But Post-Xi, I think there is a need and an opportunity for it to not be zero sum, and for their manufacturing and our development experience offering alternatives at scale, at speed. I mean, we should be riding that Belt and Road initiative of theirs and giving India's UPI and DPI and every development solution that we are offering. So there is no reason why we can't do that. We are the single largest beneficiary of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China has built. The largest number of money that that bank has put in is to Indian projects. New Development Bank has the largest beneficiary is India. So every Chinese new institution has India as its largest beneficiary. I always tell people that China builds these banks so that they can give money to us, because bilaterally we won't take. So they create these, so BRICS and all these institutions are way of both of us to conduct mature adult diplomacy even as we fight like kids, right? So the problem is that the current Chinese regime is abrasive, aggressive, expansive. It will not remain so, and there will be an opportunity. Sorry, very long answer to a very simple question, but it was a complex question. Sir.
Hi, I'm Dinesh Verma. I'm a medical doctor turned tech entrepreneur in the medical device sector. And I'm also a returning Indian diaspora NRI, or still trying to return, I should say. I have two questions. One is linked to healthcare, other is linked to economy. So there's a growing feeling amongst many economists which are sort of, who are saying that should GDP be the only criteria? Should we not be talking about other things? And I remember when Nicola Sturgeon was Scottish First Minister, she started a project with, I think it was with New Zealand and Finland, the three land countries, who said GDP should not be the criteria for growth. It should be, happiness index or whatever. There should be other things. So looking at India now, I lived in India many, many years and then went abroad. Yes, our GDP is growing and we keep talking about 4 trillion, but we don't have clean air to breathe. We don't have clean water to drink. We don't have drainage systems. And all these big things you talked about, I loved it. But the effect on the ground level is not there. Because, now,
is this the economy question or healthcare question?
So this is the economy question.
Okay.
So GDP versus something else. Great. So that these things are taken into account rather than just per capita income.
Sure.
The healthcare question is, we are really messing up our healthcare. And this is, my question is, why cannot government do something about it? What we have done in the last 10, 15 years is create this divisive thing between the Western medicine and the traditional system. Doctors have lost trust. All the saga about Ramdev and Coronil and all those things. And also, within the society, I see the have-nots and haves, both are suffering. So have-nots in Goa, I have domestic servants in my complex working, none of them have healthcare. They all go private, they come begging to me, sir, koi dawai de do, paise nahi hai. All of them, because they are not Goans, they are migrants from somewhere else, they can't get a card. And when I look at the haves, the ones who are rich, who can afford, they are suffering because the trust is lost. So we get, one opinion, second opinion, third opinion, so much of wastage. Every hospital does the investigations again, and I feel really, really terrible. Okay. So these are my two questions.
No, see, let me take the second first, and then I'll go to the GDP one. The second first, look, let's, on the haves who have lost trust, the good news is haves have lost trust even in the US. So today, if you look at what is happening in the US, there is absolutely no trust in the US with Fauci and the entire medical system, what they did during the pandemic. So rich people will find their problems, and I am not interested in solving those first world problems. Let's talk about the next 7 billion. So I'm focused more on those. So us half ko chhod dete hain. That part we'll leave. They need some things to do, so they worry about these multiple things. Let them go to doctors. They want company and they want someone to talk to. They go to multiple doctors. Now let's talk about the first one. Now, I think, and this may not have reached Goa, and I don't know why, perhaps you should send me a mail and I'll find out. But there is now a marker and a digital system where not only is migratory labor protected across jurisdictions, it is now important and in fact compulsory to register them in that system so that when they move across borders, the same health insurance that is available to them in a particular part of the country is available all across the country. And I'm sure in Goa you have that onboarding as well, and Mr. Salgaonkar would certainly know because his enterprises would have done this to all his people, so you must talk to him. This exists in India. So there is no reason for anyone to remain unprotected, and I would say one of our most significant successes has been not only in cities, and perhaps in cities sometimes we need to focus more because people get lost in the crowd, but we've been able to do this even in rural India. As migratory labor went back to their villages, they were unprotected, and how did we protect them? So I think this is an exercise that India is deeply engaged with, and we are working hard to respond to. I'm not saying we have found that solution, but solutions exist, and maybe Mr. Salgaonkar can let you know on how to find cover for migrant laborers who are working on different parts of the country, because an Aadhaar card allows you so much access to so many things today which was earlier impossible to. I'm not again saying that we've reached the, so even if you're covered, will you find a dispensary? That's a second challenge. Even if you reach a dispensary, will you find the medicines available? We have multiple issues, don't get me wrong. The point I'm trying to say is I think visibilizing the invisible is something that we have done well, and we should certainly be able to do that easily. Now when it comes to the biggest deficiency that we have in our health system is doctors. The number of doctors per 1,000 people is lower in India than anywhere else in the world. Not only that, it is not only that most of our doctors now are concentrated in big cities and even within cities there are grades. So even within cities you see concentration. So there is a system, even with there's a class system even within the cities. So you are seeing large unserved populations which have complete absence of doctors, and I think that is something that needs to be rectified. And in a country like China, for example, let's go back to the China model. It was very clear that if you were to do a medical degree from a certain university, you would spend so many years in rural China serving people there, and it was easy to pass that diktat, and by the decree of the emperor, you are now assigned to this rural village. That would be simple to do that. In a democracy, it's not that easy. So I think public service and remuneration, equally important, what you give to them for doing that, is something we need to really think about. Otherwise, you will find the migration to big cities, and those who can't come to these big cities go overseas. You will see both kinds of outflows affecting your capability to serve your population. So I think availability of doctors in large parts of India is one big challenge we face in the health sector. That is again the knowledge industry that we were talking about, but also the socio-cultural change we really need to think about. So I don't have an answer for that part of your healthcare question, but certainly on visibilizing and covering people under certain schemes is something that we have taken strides towards. I'm again not a complete project, but certainly if it exists in Goa, do write to me, and I will get someone who works in my team on the health sector to actually talk to his folks and maybe even write about it, to see how we can accelerate this process, because it is something that we must focus on. No one who is working somewhere should be uncovered. It is in this day and age, everyone should be visible. We may have still inadequate facilities, but they should not be denied access to those that exist, and I think that's the point that we must respond to. On the GDP, look, I really believe Indira Gandhi on one thing she said: poverty is the biggest pollutant. You bring your GDP up, air becomes cleaner by itself. I can give you, and I can tell you that, since where were you living, sir? Dinesh, where were you living? Which part of the world? No, when you came back, so you've returned from where? Scotland. So since you were in Scotland, let me give you an example of UK, right? So in London, we used to have something called the London frock coat. The London frock coat was worn by everyone in the 70s because you could not walk in the streets of London in a white shirt without soot and hydrocarbon coal emissions dirtying your shirt. So in the 60s and 70s, and then it vanished. As you move through higher, cleaner fuels, as you move to different levels of affluence and cooking systems, and how you manage your construction machineries, and Every country in the world, including Beijing in the turn of this century, when I used to be in Beijing in 2010, you couldn't see 3 feet. It used to be that polluted. You go to Beijing today, it is blue skies. That's the difference in a decade. I was talking about Delhi recently to someone. We had a real bad week in November, maybe around 10 days, right? Real bad 10 days. In fact, few flights had to be diverted. They went to Jaipur. They couldn't even land. That was the level of pollution. It was not fog. It was pollution, right? We had 10 days. We used to have 2 months, 5 years ago. For 2 months, we had over 1,000. I'm not saying it is less or more. I am saying that if you have lived in Delhi like I do, from 2010 to 2024, I'm telling you this is a every year winter phenomena which is becoming shorter. We will meet in 2034, this phenomena would have sorted itself for 2 reasons, and I'll tell you why. Number one, at 500 parts per million, we go berserk today in Delhi. Every headline is about the health, and it must be, rightly so. At that time, in 2011-12, when you spoke to a Delhi person, including me, yours truly, they would say, okay, we didn't care. Today we make it headline news, and we fight and we scream and we shout and we embarrass whoever we were inured to the kind of lifestyle we were living in. We had become accustomed to it. That has changed. Our generation, and I always say we are the lost generation, we did very little. We lived with nonsense. The next generation does not live with that nonsense. They raise their voice, they make their parents raise their voice, they make their grandparents raise their voice. They are actually catalyzing a lot of social pressure. That is absolutely important. In fact, Nitin Pai, one of a very intelligent person in Bangalore, tweeted something that unless social capital is deployed, you cannot clean pollution issues. You cannot. It has nothing to do with GDP. GDP is positive. Our life expectancy is going up. Our child mortality has gone down. Our women numbers have improved. GDP is essential for our growth. It is good when you reach $50,000, 50,000 pounds of existence as a per capita income. When you talk about we don't need GDP, we want better golf courses. That is good to talk about there. For us, low GDP, low income means death. It means lack of infrastructure, it means lack of hospitals, it means lack of medicines, it means lack of energy. We die. For us, that debate is an alien debate. It's good to have it in rich countries. We need to grow. We need to add to our taxes, our revenues, and invest in public infrastructure and public goods. We need to do it right. We need to move from using wood for cooking to clean gas. Then we have to move to solar stoves. We have to progress, and we are doing it. So in some sense, for me, this is the wrong debate. GDP is essential. The quality GDP is even more essential. What is that GDP investing into? And that is the point I was making from the dais, that are we embracing technology for better ways of living? Are we embracing green transitions for better ways of cooking, for transportation, etc., etc.? Yes, we are. We are doing it to the extent of our capabilities. And if the world was to become a little more sensitive to the fact that we require climate finance at scale, and I'm not talking about loans and I'm not talking about donation and aid, I'm talking about commercial capital at scale, we would do it faster. So yes, GDP is not the only measure, but GDP is an essential measure for a low income country that is seeking to address 20th and 21st century challenges at the same time. There is no other measure, no other more relevant measure. Yes, you can also go in the morning to Lodi Garden and see people laughing and doing yoga, and if that makes you happy, that is one way of looking at our progress. We have those clubs as well. But at this stage, I think money in government treasury to deploy for many of these essential needs that people have is an important Indian ambition.
Good evening, sir. My question is on China, and this refers to the earlier part of your presentation when you did mention that China can never attain the kind of ascendancy that America has. My question is that it does have the military and the economic muscle to attain its goals of domination, whether it be in the Pacific or in Asia and so on. And why, in your opinion, sir, do you feel that this can't be achieved by them, number one? And number two, if it is achieved, what is the impact on the reduction of or the suffocation of the influence on America? And what are the implications for countries like India and others if China was actually to reach that ascendancy, which I believe they can, and I'd like to hear from you as to why do you feel that it can't? It has all the ingredients to reach there. Thank you.
No, it's a fair question to ask, and because it was not an essential point I was making there, I did not elaborate on it. But American preeminence was based on its own capabilities, military, economic, most importantly, socio-cultural. Hollywood did more for America than for American soft power and American brand than its military did. American enterprise, private sector, they used to say America has 4 famous generals: General Motors, General Electric, General Atomic, and General Ford. There was a joke about America that America has 4 very powerful generals. So American enterprise. So one was this attribute of America, which was very uniquely American, that you have a polysemic cultural industry that defines what you wear, what you eat, how you dress, how you shape your body, what you do with your hairstyle, what you do with your holidays. America became, through its polysemic cultural forms, polysemic means largely universal messaging, more able to penetrate more of our lives than anyone else has been able to. There was something very simple about them, the bumper sticker view of the world, the simple bumper sticker view of the world described Americans more easily than Confucius logic ever will. So America was more easily understood and embraced in, Rambo, right? Rambo. He goes and he blows up parts of Southeast Asia, then Afghanistan, and his movies are watched in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia. Rambo was a hero even in those countries where he used to go and blow them up. So that was the universal appeal of Rambo and Rocky Balboa. He would, go and bash up the Russians or someone else. So my point here is but even as America built its cultural, economic and military capabilities, it was a relative gap with the rest. It was a devastated Europe. There was no number 2. There was no one even who was close to being number 2. It was a waste, it was a battlefield that was literally still smoldering from the embers of World War II. American eminence did not have any number 2. It was number 13 or 14. The difference between America and the rest was so huge, between the Soviet Union and the rest was so huge, that their ability to dominate was unchallenged, and their only challenges were each other. That is not the case with China. China has people nipping on their heels. It has Japan, it has India. China has been beaten by every neighbor other than us. Vietnam gave them a bloody nose. In Korea they learned a lesson. Right? So my point I'm trying to make here is that the Chinese may build up their own capabilities, but others around them the relative gap with others is very little, and others are catching up. The Japanese are a very strong military actor in that region. If they ever decide to be adventurous in Taiwan, don't watch the Americans, watch the Japanese and what they do. The first respondent will be the Japanese, not the Americans. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the Chinese don't have that landscape that the Americans did in a post-war era, where American capabilities were significantly higher than any other person. They may still become as powerful as America, they may still become as economically sophisticated as America, but others around them also will. The gap between them and the others will never relatively be so large that they will be able to dominate. And that's the difference between Pax Sinica and Pax Americana. Pax Americana had America on top of the hill and others below. Pax Sinica will have multiple peaks around them, and that is the Chinese tragedy. That they will never have that moment again in contemporary times. Okay, does it answer your question?
Yes.
And therefore I'm not responding to the second part because I don't think it's, in my opinion, that is relevant. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm Rahul Tripathi. I teach both political science and international relations at Goa University. So the question on theorizing this from an Indian perspective becomes important for me. So first point is an invitation. We are having a conference precisely on this issue in March, focusing on India and global political economy, where an Indian perspective on global political economy, if that can emerge. So I would like to use Pushkar's influence to get you to that conference if possible.
My Raisina happens in March, but what are your dates?
It may be 7th and 8th of March.
Too close to Raisina. It's 17th, 18th, 19th. But I'll try.
We'll-
If I don't come, call Gautam Chikramani.
Okay, sure.
Call him. He's doing work on this. He'll be very interested in calling.
That would be wonderful. Second, very short question. In the midst of these global aspirations and meaningful interventions, has India given up on South Asia? I remember C. Rajamohan's article, Farewell South Asia, where he felt that, if we are confronted with a South Asia which is not responding to our own positioning, doesn't realize what India can do for them, perhaps it's best to move beyond. What is your take?
No, I am not giving up on South Asia, and I don't have. I've not read the article, but if it sounded that fatalistic, I don't agree with it. So, I believe in South Asia. I also believe in the western end of South Asia. I don't think the time is right to attend to it at this stage, because Pakistan needs to solve itself before it can have a conversation with anyone else. I think they need to first have an internal debate on who they are, and then we can have a discussion with them. So I think that part we can certainly be alive to, but not necessarily engage with at this time. But I think the rest of South Asia we must engage with. And my view is that it's not easy for them, for many of these countries, to see such a large behemoth emerge that has the ability to sign a $4 billion check and has the ability to perform certain tasks that were unimaginable 50 years ago. So they need time to adjust. They are going to feel vulnerable at moments. They are going to feel threatened at times. Our building up of capacity to compete with the Chinese makes them feel quite, in many ways inadequate. The differentials are so large, as we were speaking, that it sometimes leads to certain insecure responses. We have to give them time to adjust to an emerging India. We have to be patient with them. We have to be the bigger actor. We have to be the bigger country. We have to be the bigger person in the room when we deal with countries who are smaller than us. Like we were expecting richer and more powerful nations to cut us slack. We must extend the same courtesy to our neighbors as well. I believe in South Asia. I believe in a Bay of Bengal community. I also believe in an Arabian Sea community. I think India must architect a Bay of Bengal community, which is BIMSTEC, but it also must now invest in an Arabian Sea community, which must have the UAE, Saudis and others as partakers of the cradle of globalization. It was Arabian Sea and monsoons that connected the world, and I think we must, as we re-globalize in the next decades, we must invest in that re-globalization by building these communities of the future. So I am not giving up on South Asia, and I like South Asia.
Samir, one last question.
Sure.
Maybe
the lady there who's been wanting the mic, but I'll also take two. Let me take three together, and sure, we'll do a quick fire round. I'll take all three of them and respond to all three at the same time. No, the mic is coming to you. Okay, go ahead. What's your name? Okay.
Good evening, sir. My name is Shikha. I'll just keep it at that for now. Okay, maybe I'll add that I have about 20 years worth of international corporate experience in IT, and I think I got into IT just as people were starting to learn to spell information and technology together. That's one aspect of my life. The other aspect of my life is coming from a very philosophy-oriented, not Hindutva, but philosophy-oriented background. Oh goodness, the kind of planks we have to walk today. I guess I'm going to ask you a question thank you, sir, thank you. Whereby I think I have seen what's happened in the West and Middle East in the name of development, in the name of GDP. And when I look at India, I'm going to ask you three mini questions. Development, that's what you think is what India is going to offer, development economy. Development, in my view, is based, in my experience, life experience, is based on the level of literacy and numeracy. And with my work with colleges and universities today, I'm unfortunately finding that literacy and numeracy has taken an absolute nosedive on the grassroots levels, thanks to tech first. So I'm going to link the two together. Okay, now tech first, brilliant phrase, unfortunately not coined by developing countries. It's a phrase coined by masters who sell technology. So when you say tech first, are you positioning India as a consumer of tech first or as a producer of breakneck technology?
And the third part?
And the third part would be, I think you guys spoke briefly on knowledge, creation of knowledge. And I think all of that, and sorry, the third part is linked to deteriorating languages. So when you said we should probably move from English first, unfortunately tech first implies English first. None of us in this room, maybe there is one outlier, uses our mobile phones on an Indian language.
Fair enough.
Semantic. That's me.
Can I take the other two questions and then?
Yeah, my name is Audumbar Vandodkar. I'm a medical doctor. Well, this is not related to the third way, but it's a very sharp and narrow question connected to my region, that is Goa.
Okay.
It's about dual citizenship. The last decade, statistics showed that out of thousands of Indian passports or the citizenship which are surrendered, 46% were from Goa, and there is a reason for it. There's a huge chunk of Goans, because they are born in Portuguese India, registered their birth in Portugal, which is their right, and which I am told is a natural justice to anybody who is born in Portuguese India. And India declared, of course, people who are, after liberation, you naturally become an Indian citizen by acquisition. So the question is this. Because of job opportunities and better aspirations, there's a huge lot moving to Europe, meaning London and other countries, not exactly in the European Union. And there's a dichotomy here. When they come back, they face a lot of problems. There is this strong feeling, there's a group who feels too much nationalistic. So my question is about dual citizenship and your take on this particular issue.
There was a gentleman there. Final question, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, good evening, sir. I'm Dr. Rajiv.
A lot of doctors here.
I'm Professor Dr. Rajiv
Okay, Professor.
of Management Studies. So my question is about latest news which Trump has passed on. BRICS.
Dollar.
Yeah. BRICS. 100%. What is your take on that?
Even I will add 10% to it if you go to, if you remove it. That's a no-brainer. I don't think the dollar is being replaced by anyone for a while right now. In fact, I think the Chinese renminbi is now at its century low. I think it's fallen just yesterday or a couple of days ago. The Chinese economy is struggling at this point of time. So I don't think dollar is moving away. I think Trump has used his opportunity to announce no one is serious about the dollar. Certainly we are not. The Russians and the Chinese had proposed it 3 or 4 years ago, and I think everyone else, including the Brazilians and Indians and South Africans, that walked out of the room. So it's not a BRICS conversation also. That's just noise. It's noise. Nothing serious about it. And I don't think it's going to go away. The demise of America and the demise of dollar are highly exaggerated. They're not going away anywhere. They are here for a while. So let's get used to it and make most of it. On dual citizenship, big question for India is not dual citizenship. Big question for India is, like I said at the very beginning, not many caught on to it, that with only 6% share in global GDP, India has 29% workforce, people in the workforce age bracket. So how can you employ anyone, any politician who says that when 6% of the global GDP I can give 29% of the global jobs, he's lying. We can't do that. So we have to be far more nimble and agile and forget about just vernacular. We have to also create Japanese conclaves and French conclaves and German conclaves where actually people here can be trained with skills and language skills, both, not only to serve their own well-being, but the others who will now increasingly depend on global mobile workforces. And at that point, we have to start thinking about our whole nation and whole conception of the passport. And I think, like many nations have reached the conclusion that dual citizenship is not a bad idea. I think we have to reach that economic moment where we can reach that same conclusion. At this point of time, I think it is going to be very difficult to allow that based on a Goan experience. But increasingly, I find that 30 million Indians who already now are part of the non-Indian global landscape, and another tens and tens of millions who are going to become part of that in the coming decades, is at some point going to make us really think about the utility of retaining them as citizens rather than losing them as citizens? Are we happy with just the remittance economy, or are we going to benefit from them being co-owners of India's future? So I think that bigger economic question is something that we really need to think about. Right now, we are quite satisfied, and I'm not saying I am satisfied, I'm saying we means as a nation seem to be quite satisfied across party lines that we get $150 billion of remittances back from those who've gone abroad, and that is our permanent FDI, blah, blah, blah. I think we have to understand that in the knowledge age and in an age where innovation and talent really matters and is scarce, having them back here, to create our own golden visa programs. In fact, countries around the world are wanting to attract talent and wanting to bring them back, even if partially for a year in their midst, to be able to benefit from them. We have to start thinking about that as well. So it's a very important question. I hope more Indians engage on this in the coming days, because I don't like the idea of us becoming a remittance driven or remittance satiated diaspora. I think we need to bring it back to do more. And by the way, to be honest, much of our transformation in this decade is courtesy many of those who had gone, who have come back and built those bridges and built those capabilities. So let's be honest here, that if we had rolled out the red carpets for them instead of rolling out the red carpets for many countries who never came, we might have, and one of the ways of rolling out the red carpet is by giving them their sense of being part of the Indian story and being Indian. So I'm just thinking loudly, I've not really applied my mind to it, but I do know that 100 million Indians will need to be serving different geographies in the coming 20 years. What are you going to do with them? Are you going to lose them, or are you going to continue to benefit from them being part of your journey? So I think that's the big question for us. It's not the 30 million who are outside, it is the 100 million who are going to be going outside. That is the question we need to be thinking about, and that's my response to you. I don't have an answer, but very important question. On Shikha's question, Shikha, first, were you there during the Y2K bug? No, right? You joined right after that, or were you there? Right after that. So I think Y2K bug was, there was no bug. It was an Indian hoax that was created to force everyone in the Western world to have an Indian engineer in their office. That is how we rebranded ourselves from being snake charmers to technicians. That was, and then later on to the white collar bankers when the financial crisis hit in 2008-9. So I think, anyways, so that was just an aside that it's good that you've been in the sector for 20 years. Tech first is not a Microsoft phrase. Although their vice president did use it. The vice chairman, sorry, not vice president, the vice chairman, Brad Smith, did use it, who's in charge of the global affairs. I think tech first has far more indigenous origins. It is I would argue that the Iron Age that was born here in India, the Iron Age was the first tech first civilization. And I think we need to reclaim many of these labels that had been appropriated by others in the last few hundred years. People don't realize that in the last 2000 years of, we had been the number one GDP for 15 or 16 of those years. The last 20 100-year periods, there were at least 15 100-year periods where we were the leading GDP of the world. Between us and China, you would see the tango taking place, and many of the origins of science-led advancement was actually here. So I am not interested. So here is where I agree with you and where I depart from the current conversation, I don't believe we are a tech-first nation yet. We are the largest consumers of tech for sure, and I think that's the difference. A tech-first nation, our first step towards a tech-first nation, and this is truly an innovation and truly an astounding innovation, was building a billion people plus platform called the digital payments platform. This was the first platform designed, produced here, open source, given to the world to use, which was not invented or created by outsiders, because they did not believe it was a service that needed to be catered to. It was not a development imperative for them, for their market economies, to actually be focusing on this. Now, I think we have had a taste of, very small by the way, I'm not saying it's that great and intricate a platform, but we built a billion people plus platform where you can actually also send SMSs to each other. And that platform can also send images to each other. That platform can, eventually that you had a potential of that becoming a WeChat equivalent of India, and has the capability of elevating itself to health services, investment services, many other services. So we've taken a very small step, but we are still largely the largest consumers of tech, and we must not take pride in being that, no matter if one of my flippant remarks in one conference somewhere became quite viral. I truly believe that India should not, and here is where I disagree with the Bangalore crowd, India should not be working on LLMs created by outside. We must create our own LLMs. And I know in India there are many who believe we should use the existing LLMs and build our infrastructure on top of that. I believe we need to build our own LLM. So I believe a tech first country will build its own AI ecosystem, and that is truly what I believe in. And I don't think we have reached a national consensus on this yet, because like I said, our private sector is still rather conservative and it is risk averse, and they are willing to live with smaller and more predictable returns than investing in breakthrough technologies that sometimes require decades of commitment. And I think we have not reached that expeditionary private sector yet in India. But here is my prediction in Goa in 2024 as we close this year. In 10 years time, India's top 10 business leaders will have 5 whose names we don't know today. Here is my prediction, that this next wave of digitalization and innovation is going to produce 3 to 4 to 5 Indians who are going to be in eminent position in 10 years time. They are going to create wealth and valuations around technologies, and some of them are going to be the tech first entrepreneurs. I hope they are going to be the builders of the undergirding of technology and not the consumer of technologies. I want folks who build those, the hardwiring on which technology rides, not necessarily the sophisticated softwares and codes. I'm not interested in coders. I'm interested in inventors. I think India is suffering from a lack of inventors in the last 3 or 4 decades. We have had enough coders and operators ride on those. Inventors is where India lacks, and I think that's my hope, that in the next 10 years we'll find some of those. That's my hope. I'm betting on that. That's why I'm betting on this country. Rahul ji, I answered your question that dollar अब जितने हैं रखिए घर पे, बढ़ता रहेगा डॉलर. Tripathi ji, don't give up on the dollar. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I was just about to say that, somewhere the last 15-20 minutes, I got the sense that we could talk on forever with or without liquids. But thank you for such an engaging session, and thank you so much for taking the time to come to the International Center.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And we'll try to get you again.